The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Chapter 1. An Unexpected Party. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole, filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. It had a perfectly round door like a porthole, painted green, with a shiny yellow brass knob in the exact middle. The door opened onto a tube-shaped like hall tunnel. A very comfortable tunnel without smoke, with paneled walls, floors tiled and carpeted, provided with polished chairs, and lots of pegs for hats and coats. The hobbit was fond of visitors. The tunnel wound on and on, going fairly but not quite straight into the side of a hill. The hill, as all the people for many miles around called it, and many little round doors opened out of it, first on one side and then on the other. No going upstairs for the hobbit. Bedrooms, bathrooms, cellars, pantries, lots of these. Wardrobes, he had whole rooms devoted to clothes. Kitchens, dining rooms, all were on the same floor, and indeed on the same passage. Best rooms were all on the left-hand side, going in, for these were the only ones to have windows, deep-set round windows looking over his garden and the meadows beyond, sloping down to the river. This hobbit was a very well-to-do hobbit, and his name was Baggins. The Bagginses had lived in the neighborhood of the hill for time out of mind, and people considered them very respectable, not only because of them were rich, but also because they never had any adventures or anything unexpected. You could tell what a Baggins would say on any question without bother of asking them. This is a story of how a Baggins had an adventure, found himself doing and saying things altogether unexpected. He may have lost the neighbor's respect, but he gained. Well, you'll see whether he gained anything in the end. The mother of our particular hobbit. What is a hobbit? I suppose hobbits need some description nowadays, since they have become rare and shy of the big people, as they call us. They are, or were, a little people, about half our height, smaller than the bearded dwarves. Hobbits have no beards. There is little or no magic about them, except the ordinary, everyday sort, which helps them to disappear quietly and quickly when large, stupid folk like you and me come blundering along, making a noise like elephants which they can hear a mile off. They are inclined to be fat in the stomach. They dress in bright colors, chiefly green and yellow, wear no shoes because their feet grow natural leathery soles and thick warm brown hairs like the stuff on their heads, which is curly. Have long, clever brown fingers, good-natured faces, and a laugh, deep, fruity laughs, especially after dinner, which they have twice a day when they can get it. Now you know what to go on with. As I was saying, the mother of this hobbit, a Bilbo Baggins, that is a famous Belladonna Took, one of the 3 remarkable daughters of the old Took, head of the hobbits who lived across the water, the small river that ran at the foot of the hill. It was often said, in other families, that long ago one of the Took ancestors must have taken a fairy wife. That was, of course, absurd, but certainly there was still something not entirely hobbit-like about them. Once in a while, members of the Took clan would go and have adventures. They discreetly disappeared, and the family hushed it up, but the fact remained that the Tooks were not as respectable as the Bagginses, though they were undoubtedly richer. Not that Belladonna Took ever had any adventures after she became Mrs. Bungo Baggins. Bungo, that was Bilbo's father, built the most luxurious hobbit hole for her, and partly with her money, that was to ever be found either under the hill or over the hill or across the water, and there they remained to the end of their days. Still, it was probable that Bilbo, her only son, although he looked and behaved exactly like the second edition of his solid and comfortable father, got something a bit queer in his makeup from the Took side, something that only waited for a chance to come out. The chance never arrived until Bilbo Baggins was grown up, being about 50 years old or so, and living in the beautiful hobbit hole built by his father, which I have just described for you, until he had become, in fact, apparently settled down immovably. By some curious chance one morning, long ago, in the quiet of the world, when there was less noise and more green, and the hobbits were still numerous and prosperous, Bilbo Baggins was standing at his door after breakfast, smoking an enormous long wooden pipe that reached nearly down to his woolly toes, neatly brushed. Gandalf came by. Gandalf, if you have heard of only a quarter of what I have heard about him, and I have only heard of very little of all there is to hear, you'd be prepared for any sort of remarkable tale. Tales and adventures sprouted up all over the place wherever he went, in the most extraordinary fashion. He had not been down the way under the hill for ages and ages, not since his old friend the Old Took died. In fact, and hobbits had almost forgotten what he'd looked like. He had been away over the hill and across the water on business on his own since they were small hobbit boys and hobbit girls. All that the unsuspecting Bilbo saw the morning was an old man with a staff. He had a tall, pointed blue hat, a long gray scarf, a silver scarf over, or long gray cloak rather, a silver scarf over his long beard, hung down below his waist, and immense black boots. "Good morning," said Bilbo, and he meant it. The sun was shining, and the grass was very green. But Gandalf looked at him from under the long bushy eyebrows that stuck up further than the brim of his shady hat. "What do you mean?" he said. "Do you wish me good morning, or mean that it is a good morning whether I want it to or not? Or do you feel good this morning? Or is this morning meant to be a good one?" "Oh, all of them at once," said Bilbo. "And a very fine morning for a pipe of tobacco out of doors, into the bargain. You have a pipe about you, sit down and have a fill of mine. There's no hurry. We have all day before us." Then Bilbo sat down by the seat at his door, crossed his legs, and blew out a beautiful gray smoke ring that sailed up into the air without breaking and floating away over the hill. "Very pretty," said Gandalf. "I have no time to blow smoke rings this morning. I'm looking for someone to share in an adventure that I am arranging, and it is very difficult to find anyone." "I should think so. In these parts, we are plain, quiet folk and have no use for adventures. Nasty, disturbing, uncomfortable things. Make you late for dinner. I can't think of what anybody sees in them," said our Mr. Baggins. Stuck one thumb behind his braces, blew out another, even bigger smoke ring. Then he took out his morning letters and began to read, pretending to take no more notice of the old man. He had decided that he was not quite his sort, and wanted him to go away. But the old man did not move. He stood leaning on his stick, gazing at the hobbit without saying anything, till Bilbo got quite uncomfortable and even a little cross. "Good morning," he said at last. "We don't want any adventures here, thank you. You might try over the hill or across the water." By this he meant the conversation was at an end. "What a lot of things do you use good morning for?" Gandalf said. "Now, you mean that you want to get rid of me, and that it won't be good till I move off." Not at all, my dear sir. Let me see. I don't think I know your name." Yes, my dear sir, and I do know your name, Mr. Bilbo Baggins. You do know my name, though you don't remember that I belong to it. I am Gandalf, and Gandalf means me. To think that I should have lived to be a good morning to buy a Belladonna Took's son, as if I was selling buttons at the door." Gandalf, good gracious me. Not the wandering wizard that gave old Took a pair of magic diamond studs that fastened themselves and never came undone till ordered. Not the fellow who used to tell such wonderful tales at parties, about dragons and goblins and giants, and the rescue of princesses and unexpected luck of the widow's son. Not the man that used to make such particularly excellent fireworks. I remember those. Old Took used to have them on Midsummer's Eve splendid. They used to go up like great lilies and snapdragons and labor bums and a fire and hang in the twilight all evening. You'll notice already that Mr. Baggins was not quite so prosy as he liked to believe, also that he was very fond of flowers. Dear me, he went on, not the Gandalf who was responsible for so many quiet lads and lasses going off into the blue for mad adventures. Anything from climbing trees to visiting elves or sailing in ships, sailing to our other shores. Bless me, life used to be quite you used to be upset, You used to upset things badly in these parts once upon a time. I beg your pardon, but I had no idea that you were still in business. Where else should I be? Said the wizard. All the same, I am pleased to find that you remember something about me. You seem to remember my fireworks kindly, at any rate. And that is not without hope. Indeed, for your old grandfather Took's sake, for the sake of poor Belladonna, I'll give you what you have asked for. I beg your pardon, I haven't asked for anything. Yes, you have, twice now. Pardon, I give it to you. In fact, I'll go so far as to send you on this adventure. Very amusing for me. Very good for you. And profitable, too, very likely, if you ever get over it. Sorry, I don't want any adventures, thank you. Not today. Good morning. Please come to tea, any time you like. Why not tomorrow? Come tomorrow. Goodbye. And with that, the hobbit turned and scuttled inside his round green door, and shut it as quickly as he dared, not to seem rude. Wizards are wizards, after all. What on earth did I ask him to tea for? He said to himself as he went to the pantry. He only just had breakfast, but he thought a cake or two and a drink of something would do him good after his fright. Gandalf, in the meantime, was still standing outside the door and laughing long but quietly. After a while he stepped up, and with the spike on his staff, he scratched a queer sign on the hobbit's beautiful green door. Then he strode away, just about the time when Bilbo was finishing up his second cake and beginning to think he had escaped adventures very well. The next day he had almost forgotten about Gandalf. He did not remember things very well, unless he put them down in his engagement table, like this. Gandalf tea Wednesday. Yesterday he had been too flustered to do anything of the kind. Just before the tea time, there came a tremendous ring at the front door bell, and then he remembered. He rushed and put on the kettle and put out another cup and a saucer, an extra cake or two, and ran to the door. So sorry to keep you waiting, he was going to say, and when he saw that it was not Gandalf at all. It was a dwarf with a blue beard tucked into a golden belt, very bright eyes under his dark green hood. As soon as the door was open, he pushed inside, as if he had been expected. He hung his hooded cloak on the nearest peg and said, Dwalin at your service, he said with a low bow. Bilbo Baggins at yours, said the hobbit, too surprised to ask any questions for the moment. When the silence that followed had become uncomfortable, he added, I'm just about to make tea. Pray come in and have some with me. A little stiff, perhaps, but he meant it kindly. And what would you do if an uninvited dwarf came and hung up his things in your hall without a word of explanation? They had not been at the table for long. In fact, they had hardly reached the third cake, when came another even louder ring at the bell. Excuse me, said the hobbit, and went off to the door. So you got here at last. That's what he was going to say to Gandalf this time. But it was not Gandalf. Instead, there was a very old-looking dwarf on the step with a white beard and a scarlet hood. And he, too, hopped inside as soon as the door was open, just as if he had been invited. I see they have begun to arrive already, he said when he caught sight of Dwalin's great hood hanging out. He hung his red one next to it and said, Dwalin, at your service, he said with his hand on his breast. Thank you, said Bilbo with a gasp. It was not the correct thing to say, but they had begun to arrive had him flustered badly. He liked visitors, but he liked to know them before they had arrived, and preferred to ask them himself. He had a horrible thought that the cake might run short, and then he, as the host, he knew his duty and stuck to it however painful, might have to go without. Come along in and have some tea, he managed to say after taking a long breath. A little beer would suit me better, if it's all the same to you, my good sir, said Balin with the white beard. But I don't mind some cake, seed cake if you have any. Lots, Bilbo found himself answering, to his own surprise. Found himself scuttling off, too, to the cellar to fill a pint of beer mug, and then to the pantry to fetch 2 beautiful round seed cakes which he had baked that afternoon for his after-supper morsel. When he had got back to Balin and Dwalin, they were talking at the table like old friends. As a matter of fact, they were brothers. Bilbo plumped down the beer and the cake in front of them, and a loud ring at the bell came again, and then another ring. Gandalf for certain this time, he thought as he puffed along to the passage. But it was not. It was 2 more dwarves, both with blue hoods, silver belts, and yellow beards, and each of them carried a bag of tools and a spade. In they hopped, and as soon as the door began to open, Bilbo was hardly surprised at all. "What can I do for you, my dwarfs?" he said. "Keely at your service," said one. "And Phillies," added the other. They both swept off their blue hoods and bowed. "At yours and your families," replied Bilbo, remembering his manners this time. "Dwalin and Balin are here, I see," said Keely. "Let us join the throng." "Throng," thought Mr. Baggins. "I don't like the sound of that. I really must sit down for a minute and collect my wits and have a drink." He had only just had a sip, in the corner, while the four dwarves sat around the table. Talked about mines and golds and troubles with the goblins, and the depredations of dragons, and lots of other things which he did not understand, and did not want to. They all sounded much too adventurous when, ding-dong-a-ling-dong, his bell rang again, as if some naughty little hobbit boy was trying to pull the handle off. "Someone at the door," he said, blinking. "Some four, I would say, by the sound," said Philly. "Besides, we saw them coming along behind us in the distance." The poor little hobbit sat down in the hall and put his head in his hands and wondered what had happened, and what was going to happen, and whether they would all stay for supper. The bell rang again louder than ever, and he had run to the door. It was not 4 after all, it was 5. Another dwarf had come along while he was wandering the hall, and he had hardly turned the knob before they were all inside, bowing and saying, "At your service," one after another. Dori, Nori, Ori, Owen, and Glowing were their names. And very soon 2 purple hoods, a gray hood, a brown hood, and a white hood were all hanging on the pegs, and off they marched with their broad hands stuck in their gold and silver belts to join the others. Already it was almost become a throng. Someone called for ale, some for porter, and one for coffee, and all of them for cakes, so the hobbit was kept very busy for a while. A big jug of coffee had been set in the hearth, and the seed cakes were gone, and the dwarves were starting on a round of buttered scones. There came a loud knock. Not a ring, but a hard rat-tat on the hobbit's beautiful green door. Someone was banging with a stick. Bilbo rushed along the passage, very angry, and altogether bewildered and bewithered. That was the most awkwardly Wednesday he had ever remembered. He pulled open the door with a jerk, and they all fell in on top of one another. More dwarfs, 4 more, and there was Gandalf behind, leaning on his staff and laughing. He had made quite a dent in the beautiful door. He had also, by the way, knocked out the secret mark that he had put there in the morning before. "Carefully, carefully," he said. "It's not like you, Bilbo, to keep friends waiting on the mat, and then open the door like a popgun. Let me introduce Buford, Bofer, Bombur, and especially Thorin." "At your service," said Buford, Bofer, and Bombur, standing in the row. They hung up 2 yellow hoods and a pale green one, also a sky blue one with a long silver tassel. This last one belonged to Thorin, an enormously important dwarf, in fact, no other than the great Thorin Oakenshield himself, and who was not at all pleased at falling flat on Bilbo's mat with Buford, Bofer, and Bombur on top of him. One thing, Bombur was immensely fat and heavy. Thorin indeed was very haughty, and said nothing about service. Or Mr. Baggins said he was sorry so many times that he had grunted, "Pay no attention to it," and stopped frowning. "Now, we are all here," said Gandalf, looking at the row of 13 hoods, the best detachable party hoods, and his own hat hanging on the pegs. "Quite a merry gathering. I hope there is something left for the latecomers to eat and drink. What's that, tea? No, thank you. A little red wine, I think, for me." "And for me," said Thorin. "Raspberry jam and apple tart," said Buford. "And mince pies and cheese," said Bofer. "And pork pie and salad," said Bombur. "And more cakes, and ale, and coffee, if you don't mind," called the other dwarfs through the door. "Put on a few eggs, there's a good fellow," Gandalf called after him, as the hobbits stumped off to the pantries. "And just bring up the cold chicken and pickles." "Seems to know as much about the inside of my larder as I do myself," thought Mr. Baggins, who was feeling positively flummoxed, and was beginning to wonder whether a most wretched adventure had not come right into his house. By the time he had gotten all the bottles and dishes and knives and forks, and glasses and plates and spoons and things piled up on big trays, he was getting very hot and red in the face and annoyed. "Confiscate and bother these dwarfs," he said aloud. "Why don't they come and lend a hand?" Lo and behold, there stood Balin and Dwalin in the door of the kitchen, Billy and Keely behind him, and before he could say knife, they all whisked the trays off and a couple of small tables into the parlor and set out everything afresh.